Hello and welcome back to L&D Disrupt. This week I'm joined by our CEO and author of Learning at Speed, Nelson Sivalingam, to discuss how we can turn our biggest L&D challenges into wins and successes. We discussed why centralising information and engaging learners are two of the key fundamentals and how we can do them, why mapping and measuring skills is such a challenge, and how AI could help us do it at the scale and speed required to succeed, why we struggle to build a complete data picture and how we can actually build a real story around L&D impact, and much, much more. You'll hear Nelson talk a little bit about our new features and HowNow AI throughout the episode, but also some of the fundamental challenges we solve for our customers. And if you'd like to know more about HowNow and what we do, you can just go to getHowNow.com or use the link in the episode description. And if you like the show and you want to help us keep growing and going, then you can recommend it to a friend or leave a review, preferably 5-star, and that will help us reach more and more people. So thanks again, and I hope you enjoy this conversation with Nelson. Nelson, thank you for coming back on L&D Disrupt. It's been 5-ish months since we last spoke, and it's a worrying testament of how fast time is flying, isn't it?
I was going to say, thanks for having me back on the show, Gary. Felt like I was so bad last time, you didn't want me back on.
Oh, no, I'm sure that won't be the sentiment. We'll put a poll in the chat. Let us know. As people know from the title of this episode, Nelson, we're trying to talk about turning big L&D challenges into wins. I really like this because we've been having this conversation internally about the most challenging work often being the most impactful, and therefore the biggest challenges often represent the best opportunities, don't they? So why is it so important that L&D team do tackle those big and scary challenges?
Yeah, I think our motto has always been around, or one of them has been around kind of love the problem, not the solution. Because it's easy to kind of get carried away by shiny new objects and the new latest buzzword. But you don't buy something because it's the shiny new object. You buy something because it solves a problem, and it's really kind of focusing it back to go, look, I know this is exciting. There's a lot of things happening, but let's go back to the problems. And let's go back to those big problems that we've not been able to solve. And I think there's a few of those in L&D where we're working towards collectively to have a meaningful impact on organizations. And there are certain things that are holding us back from getting to that point, right? And that isn't just around creating content and pushing content out there. There are some real big strategic challenges for us to be able to solve. How can we get an understanding of the skills we have and don't have in our workforce, and how can we do that at the speed at which business and industries are changing? That's a really difficult challenge to solve for. And so I think it's trying to bring our attention to, let's not do what's easy to do. Let's actually push ourselves out of our comfort zone to look at what are those challenges that are stopping us from having meaningful impact. And let's see whether we can use these shiny new things to solve those. And that's really where this came from. We wanted to look at what are those big, scary challenges and how can we use technology and more specifically generative AI to tackle some of those challenges.
I don't know about you, but I've had a lot of conversations recently. Obviously, it's post-LT, and that's the time for having the most conversations with L&D folks. But there's a real appetite to solve these challenges that is, I think, driven by frustration in some ways, because people I'm speaking to are genuinely frustrated that we're still talking about some of the issues we're going to solve today. And, it's because they are big and scary challenges. We've maybe not got to the point of actually solving them. We've kicked the can down the road a little bit, but I feel like we're at a point where the real appetite is there to solve them. And that's why that tech opportunity is there to be the vehicle to finally get us over the line, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. And I often find you see this in any type of marketing where you need someone to be problem aware before they're willing to consider your solution, right? If someone doesn't know the problem exists, then they're not going to be looking for a solution. And I think in some cases, what I'm finding from the conversations I'm having with L&D teams and professionals is, the C-suite talking about their concern around availability of skills, the skills gaps that they think are in their organization is kind of putting the problem front and center. And so now I would say it's more widely in L&D, we're problem aware that actually what we shouldn't be focusing on is kind of content and if we got enough content, but actually we need to be thinking about, do we have the right skills in the business? Because that's what the C-suite are asking me about. And I find that kind of problem awareness amongst the C-suite is almost acting as a forcing function for us to kind of really look at, are we doing the right kind of work? Are we putting the resources in the right areas? And so it's good. It's a good shift that we're seeing a skills conversation across the business, to the point where it's such a significant shift. I wouldn't be surprised in some organizations if they start re-looking at chief learning officers and kind of reframe that role as a chief skills officer. Because if you look at things like, you've got a chief revenue officer where revenue is the outcome and therefore it's in the job title. This person is accountable and owns this particular outcome in the organization. And if you look at that from a CLO, chief learning officer perspective, learning isn't the outcome, right? The outcome the business wants to see is, do we have the right skills to get the work done in our organization? So, I think the conversation around skills is so front and center now. I wouldn't be surprised if I start seeing job titles changing from chief learning to chief skills officer.
Yeah, it could be. We've seen a few roles where they're starting to bring enablement into like learning and enablement,
Right.
aren't they? Because ultimately enablement is the end goal. But you're right. We'll cover this over the course of this conversation, but the goal isn't just for people to learn, it's for people to perform, and it's for people to build the skills that allow the company to continue performing. So yeah, could be a complete rebrand coming around the bend.
Yeah.
We will get into skills, but I wanted to start with a couple of things that are more fundamental challenges we see, those real early ones that unless you solve them, you're not really ready for the next part. So one of them is engagement, isn't it, Nelson? And people who've listened to kind of some of the older ones, we've been banging this drum for a while, but tell us a bit about the engagement gap and why it's still an issue that needs to be solved.
Yeah, the engagement gap is essentially, you putting out, you've got L&D initiatives, actually mentoring, coaching, courses, programs, and actually no one's engaging fundamentally. So if they're not engaging, then none of the other good stuff that you want to follow, like behavior change, performance improvement, skill development, none of that good stuff is going to happen if they don't engage. Now, just because someone engages, it doesn't mean all of that good stuff is going to happen, right? Because actually they could be engaging with learning experiences that are not the right fit to be able to drive that desired behavior change and outcome. But engagement is 100% the primary requirement in order to be able to even have a chance at driving those desired outcomes. And, there's a bunch of different reasons why we see the engagement gap existing. And often it's the case where fundamentally we're pushing out the wrong learning to the wrong people at the wrong time, and therefore we're getting the wrong results. And this often happens because of a very content heavy focus, right? Where we're focused on creating content, pushing content out, but we're ignoring the context in which employees exist, right? Like, what's the overall business strategy? What are the skills they need in order to be able to do their job better? Do you have psychological safety? Have you marketed the problem that your solution is trying to solve? There's a bunch of different variables that determine that context. And if you design learning experiences ignoring that context, it's just almost content that exists in a void, right? That it's almost the content is ignorant of the world that the employee lives in. So it's unlikely this is going to be able to meet their needs in a timely manner. And you often end up with the engagement gap, where you put out a bunch of stuff, no one engages with it. And anytime no one engages with what you put out, it's basically waste, right? You've just wasted time, effort, resources to do that. And so it's fundamental for us to be able to close that engagement gap in order to have a shot at actually driving that desired behavior change and outcome. And without doing that, without addressing those variables, just scaling content or driving efficiencies in automating routine tasks while keeping everything else the same, it's just going to help you do the thing that wasn't having impact in a slightly more efficient way, which I'm not sure is what the business wants to see.
No. And the worst thing is it's a exponentially increasing problem because the more content that's irrelevant you create, the less engaged people get. Like if you think of some of those people, maybe YouTube channels you fell out of love with, influencers you stopped following their content, it's because their content didn't connect with you and they just kept churning out more and more of the content that didn't connect with you. And over time, you get so bored with it, you unfollow. And that's kind of what happens with L&D. The more and more stuff comes down the chute that you just don't feel resonates with you at all, the less and less interested you get.
So I mean, you could see this even in like, let's have a look at this. It's where everyone who's listening to this is a consumer of some sort, right? And let's just look at content marketing. We've all at some point probably engaged with content marketing, and they're having. We can learn from that in L&D because what AI has done, it's made it much easier for you to create average content marketing, right? And so what you're going to see is an explosion of a lot of content that's very mediocre, right? And so what we're essentially doing is throwing lots and lots of crap at consumers. And the more crap we throw at consumers, the more they get desensitized and immune to content and content marketing, and therefore it becomes harder to engage. You can apply that challenge that content marketers are facing to L&D, right? Because if you're very much focused on churning out content and pushing more irrelevant content out there, what you're going to find is it's going to get only harder and harder to engage people because they now just associate you with throwing a lot of crap at them. And therefore, it's harder to engage. Therefore, you've got a bigger engagement gap, which means it's now even harder for you to bridge skills gaps and have a meaningful impact on your organization. And so, 10xing the amount of content you have with a lot less effort is actually not even about solving your problem. It might scale your problem and not your potential. So you might be actually doing yourself more harm.
Yeah, and now you've heard the challenge for content marketers like me. Please keep engaging with our content so I'm still in a job. So I guess if we're talking turning challenges into wins, it sounds like the angle here, Nelson, is to get off the hamster wheel for just create, spend more time loving that problem, understanding your audience, and then just create maybe fewer things that truly add value to that end user.
Yeah, I think it goes back to going, what is adding value, right? What does adding value mean in an organizational context? And I think this is where we often say it's understanding organizations want skills, not content, right? The real value you can add is not that you created 10x more content, it's that you helped your organization fill some of those skills gaps that they have. And I think that's a really key difference in the way a lot of L&D functions operate now as almost content factories and putting out a lot of output and a lot of training programs and courses. So I think it's aligning, if you do want to have meaningful impact and deliver value, then what the organization wants is skills. And we know that because, when have you ever had an employee come to you and say, can you give me, I know right now you give me 1 million courses. Could you give me 10 million courses? Because I really think that's what I'm missing. Or when have you ever had a CEO come to you and say, what's missing in our L&D strategy is content. We don't have enough content. No, yet many of us have probably been in a situation where we've had someone say to us, an employee talk to us about skills. What would be really helpful is if I could have support building skills X, Y, Z, right? You've probably got C-suite now asking you, what are the skills gaps that are stopping us from achieving our OKRs? It's a universal language that everyone in the business understands. And so for us to deliver value, we need to start looking at what we're doing from the lens of skills. And I think that takes us to some of the bigger challenges we have, right? And I think you could put those bigger challenges into 3 buckets. Do we understand our workforce from the lens of what skills they need to have? And the second one is, do we know what skills they actually have, what their strengths are, what their gaps are? And then do we have the learning resources to be able to bridge those gaps? And I think they're the big challenges. That's the holy grail for us to be able to identify those gaps and bridge them at the speed of business.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a nice time to move into the idea of skills, because when we talk about big, scary challenges, I get why this one is big and scary, because let's imagine you've got hundreds, thousands of people in the organization. Not only do you need to map the skills, you need to measure them, and you need to do it fast enough to put out some relevant resources or learning that helps people build the skills before the landscape changes. And you also need to do things like win stakeholders over, curate the content you need. It is a huge challenge, isn't it, to do it manually?
Or whenever we speak to how L&D teams approach it now, right? Like on average, it takes them, from what we've heard from speaking to L&D professionals, it takes about 9 to 12 months. And that's a process of, speaking to subject matter experts, speaking to managers, asking them what skills do you think your team has? What skills do you need for this particular job role? And every team and department often thinks they're special. So they've got their own special way of calling a skill that exists in every team, but they want it their way. I'm sure there are many people listening to this who probably experienced that. And so it's really hard to come up with a universal skills taxonomy. It's even harder to map that to all of the job roles that exist. And even when you map it, you might be able to say this person needs to have project management, but not everyone needs, let's say, a level 5 in project management, right? So what degree of proficiency do they need? And a manager who's super busy with a lot of other things will come up with some arbitrary numbers to go, for this role, I think it's a 3. For this role, I think it's a 4. And all of that goes into a spreadsheet. It dies in a spreadsheet because, let's face it, no one wants to go back to that spreadsheet. It's not easy to use or apply. And then, whose job is it to keep it up to date? Because there are going to be new emerging skills for that particular job role. Who the hell is keeping on top of all of this data to keep it up to date? It's just not possible to do that at the speed and scale that's relevant for businesses to be able to, bridge those gaps. And so it doesn't surprise me that there are so many L&D teams that we speak to who they know they've got to kind of solve this challenge, but it's so hard. And, you almost find the challenge that it's kind of relatively easier for you to solve and kind of show that I've solved it. But to have impact, we need to be able to solve this challenge.
And the challenge is if you do it manually, every time people come to ask you about it, you'll still be telling them, we're working on it, we're working on it, we're working on it. So you don't get to show any value. And like you say, if it goes and dies in a spreadsheet, then all of the work showed no value, short term, long term. So how do we overcome this? What is the way to actually map and measure the skills at the scale and speed required?
I think this is where, really we can leverage AI and generative AI to tap into this. And I think that's why we should really be wary around. Right now, we're underusing the potential of AI, right? We're using it for quite, short-term gains. I mean, this is a issue of our entire generation of instant gratification. We're using it to create content faster. It gives us that gratification. We've done something. We're doing it to automate routine tasks. But are we using it in a way where it's going to have that long-term benefit? That's probably what we're not seeing enough of. And so this is where we used HowNow AI to essentially solve that big challenge. And how we do that is by looking at combining real-time job market data. So looking at, what are the tasks and responsibilities associated with every job on the market, and then inferring what are the skills required and what are the proficiency levels required for someone to be able to do that task and responsibility. And what we get from that is a core skills taxonomy required for the jobs that are available in the market. We can also then contextualize that based on the jobs that exist within your organization. So we can plug into a HR system, look at what jobs you have, previous jobs people have, what responsibilities they have, and then infer what skills are required there. We then combine organizational context with job market macro data to come up with a skills taxonomy. And our skills taxonomy has just over 40,000 skills. If you're thinking that's quite exhaustive, damn right it is. And the reason why it is to cover, every industry. We've recently done this with, we had someone in the hospitality industry asking us for what skills would you map to a barista, all the way to someone who runs a tennis association a golf association. And they were like, what skills do I need for a greenkeeper? All the way to pharmaceutical companies and technology companies are doing it. So it's quite a vast taxonomy. And then using the market data, we've also built the relationship between these skills, but also between the skills and the job roles and the required level. So what would have taken you on average 9 to 12 months, right? What we're able to do is in a matter of moments, able to generate that. Now, it's not just about efficiency. what this allows you to do is have a solid data foundation for the mapping that they're doing, because it's benchmarked against the wider market. But also what you benefit from is, because we're benchmarking you against the market, we can tell you when there's an emerging skill. So one of the data points we look at is, what are the patents that are being filed? What are the research papers that are being published, which gives us an indication of some of the potential emerging skills in every industry. And so as we start to see a skill go up in demand in the job market, or based on patents that are being filed, you can start to capture those movements in skill. So what you end up with is, rather than static skills framework that lives and dies inside your spreadsheet, instead you have a dynamic skills framework that reflects your organization, benchmarks you against the market, and it's constantly evolving based on the changes that are happening in the market. And this is where you can really use AI to solve what was previously a very, very difficult challenge.
Yeah, having seen people's reactions to it, it's really cool to see, like you said, the breadth of job roles in there, and saying to people, tell us what's typically a job that you have in your organization, like no matter how random, put it into HowNow AI, and it's coming back with what people are agreeing are the skills that people in their company need, which is great. And then I guess the other part of that conversation is, once you know the skills you need and the skills you have, using the pathways to create the path to upskilling in that particular skill. So tell us a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, so I guess once you have the taxonomy, Gary, you would have seen where you've mapped the skills, and that often blows people's mind, because especially people who've gone through this pain of trying to pull together the mapping, they could really relate. I even had someone saying to me, why couldn't you have done this 6 months ago? Because it would have saved me a ton of time. But once you have that mapping, it's now about the measurement piece, right? So, okay, this is what they should have, but what do they actually have? And this is where we recommend a 360 assessment, combined self-assessment, peer assessment, and manager assessment. Again, we use AI to nudge people at the right times to be able to say, well, you should think about updating your skills proficiency level. So, if we can, AI is tracking to see you've been doing a lot of learning around project management, we'll then use that to nudge you and say, well, it looks like you've been doing a lot around project management, as your proficiency improved, etc. And you can, if I update my proficiency, we can then nudge your managers and colleagues to also do the same. And once we've done that, we now know what skill you need to have and what required level. And we now know what you actually have. So let's just say you need to have a 4 in project management, but actually you have a 3. Now, the next stage of that, I know where the gaps are. How do I bridge the gap? Now, this is what's always been quite a challenge, is how do I align learning directly to those skills gaps? Which has been a tough one, because most companies don't measure skills, so they can't actually give you evidence that these are the gaps that exist in the business. And even if they did measure skills and they knew the gaps, it's how do I align my learning to that? And this is where there's a couple of challenges. One, we've often spoken about the fact that learning is scattered. It doesn't all live inside one LMS. It's probably scattered across different tools and apps in your organization, but there's also a ton of stuff you learn outside. Like, the L&D Disrupt podcast isn't inside your LMS. And you've got blogs and webinars and ebooks and, conversations with colleagues that are all scattered. Now, the first thing you need to be able to do is you need to bring all of this scattered learning together, and you need to tag it and organize it based on your company's skills framework, right? That's really, really key. It's not good enough to just aggregate content from multiple different places, because they're all speaking different skills language, right? Like, you take a third-party provider, they've got their own tagging system. You've got your own tagging system based on your company's skills framework. YouTube has got its own tagging based on the creators. Like, none of these things are speaking the same language. So the first thing we do is we use HowNow AI to tag and organize your entire learning ecosystem based on your skills framework. Now, this is what we call the skills graph, because it tags, whether it's an individual or learning resource, it's all tagged with your skills. Now, why does that matter? Well, you can ask HowNow AI now to create a learning pathway, right? And you can give it specific goal, saying, I want this to help this anyone that I assign this to go from a level 3 to a level 5 in project management. And it now can make sense out of your learning ecosystem curate the relevant learning resources based on what skills and levels you would get from that content or resources, and then structure that based on the very best in learning design principles, right? Like scaffold the content so it really builds up from the easiest concepts to the more challenging concepts. Now, you may have done this, if you've got a big team of instructional designers or learning designers, you might do this at a high level for large groups of people, right? But by using AI to do this, I, as a manager, can create a pathway for one direct report, right? It's not that direct report skills gap doesn't matter. It's just that we never had the resources to be able to prioritize that individual skills gap. Now what we can do is actually scale meaningfully personalized pathways for every gap that every person has in the organization. And I think that is really a game changer in terms of democratizing meaningful learning for everyone.
Awesome. So to kind of maybe recap the principles for people, we're turning this challenge into win. The first would be to maybe use AI intentionally to map the skills. The thing that took you the most time before, what are the skills we're going to need for X, Y, and Z jobs in our company? Use AI to streamline that process. Make sure you're measuring the proficiency you have of those skills. Organize your content so that then you can deliver relevant pathways to people to move them from not having the skill or being a lower proficiency to the higher proficiency. Is that kind of a fair reflection of the principles we're explaining here?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. I think it's, to simplify it even more, it's for you to be able to know what skills, identify the gaps, and then connect very personalized learning experiences to those skills. And I think, just going back to the kind of measurement part of it, it's not the one-time measurement. Where AI is useful is that continuous check-in and nudges at the right moment. Because in order for you to see whether someone's growing, right, a one-time check-in is enough. It isn't enough, right? Like that's why giving someone a 2-hour assessment and trying to assess their skills isn't really great, because to get them to do that 2-hour assessment again is going to be super difficult for a time-poor employee. That's why we deliberately recommend a kind of light touch assessment that you can continuously check in. But yeah, that really is a game changer. If you think about, how, and if you're listening to this and think about how you're thinking about learning now and where most of your effort goes in terms of your time and what the outcome you can get as a result of it, I mean, this really is a game changer.
100%. And I guess that the thing is as well, even just applying those principles we talked about, there's still going to be a degree of manual effort. So if anyone's listening and heard what Nelson said about how HowNow AI can be used to solve those, and you want to learn a bit more, there'll be a link in the show notes and the description, because that really does allow you to do it at the speed and scale. And it'd be great if you're interested to see it for yourself. Nelson, I want to come back to one of the other things you mentioned there, which is one of our challenges, centralizing everything into one place. When we met to discuss the L&D trends last year, we learned that almost a third of employees are waiting days or longer for information, and over half are struggling to find documents when they're working remotely. That is such a big challenge. I mean, thinking about personal experience, the last company I worked in was half of our team was in the US, half in the UK. So there was at best 3 hours that I overlapped with people. If I didn't know where something was and I had to ask someone in the US, I have to hope that my request is valuable enough for the first 3 hours of their day. And if it's not, we're talking 2 business days before I've got the information I need. So I can completely relate to that challenge that came across in the data. But, maybe tell us a bit more about why it's such a challenge, but how it can be one of our easiest wins.
Yeah, I think, a lot of this also comes from we have great consumer products that have really made us intolerant to poor user experience, right? Like, we're so used to getting things right when we need it, right the way we want it. And, the fact that people would pay more money for a product just to be able to get it the next day delivery just goes to show how impatient we want something, and any amount of friction or is inconvenient. Now you apply that at work where, we're already saying, we all think we're busy, right? We're all time poor and we're all trying to manage a lot of things. And then you add to that any amount of friction to find the knowledge or learning that I need, right? I'm always going to choose the path of least resistance. And so if it's too difficult for me to find internally, I'm just going to go to Google, I'm just going to go search on Google because it's a lot easier for me to search and find something that's going to answer. Now, but that's not a problem for the employee, but it's a problem for the organization because the organization has probably spent a lot of time and money building, buying, learning resources and creating internal knowledge and capturing, but done such a bad job of bringing it together that there's low engagement and ROI for those things you've already spent time and money on because people are still going to Google to look for it. And so I think we need to spend as much time thinking about discovery as we do in thinking about creating content, right? Which isn't the case, right? Just if you're listening to this and you're someone who's created a lot of content, just think about how much time you spent creating the content versus how much time you spent thinking about how that content's going to be discovered. Often it's the way you probably spend 80% of your time and effort on creating the content, but 20% of the time thinking about the discovery. But it's the discovery where everything fails, right? Too much friction. I can't find it. I'm too impatient. I'm going to go to Google. And that's where centralizing really comes into place. It's not a novel idea in the large scheme of things, but it's a novel idea when you think within the sphere of kind of learning skills and knowledge. And that's why we recommend it's not about everything needs to live on one platform, but you do need a single front door to accessing all of your learning, knowledge, and skills. And that's one of, I would say, probably the most fundamental problem we solve for a lot of the organizations we work with. It's often the fact that they've got a big diverse ecosystem. It's all over the place. And the first thing we do is we integrate with it all. We bring it together into a single searchable platform. So there's a single front door. And then we tag it and organize it with skills to make it more meaningful. But that in itself strips out so much friction that previously existed. Just by doing that one thing, organizations tend to see a significant step up in the engagement they were getting because discovery is so much easier. Now you combine that with embedding that single front door in the flow of work. So now you're saying not only is there only one place you have to go to, but that one place lives everywhere you work, right? Are you in Google search? It's there. Are you in Slack? It's there, right? Which now makes it even more easier to find what we need. And so, if it takes, I often think a good measure is, if it takes L&D a long time to find what they're looking for, you might as well forget anyone else being able to find anything.
Yeah, I think we can all relate to that. It's something I've created. It's in a folder. I can't remember exactly which one of my folders is in. So if I created it and it's my folder and I still don't know how to find it. I love that framing of it not being a problem for the employee, but being a problem for the organization, because you're right. Let's imagine that I work in the customer support team and there's a real issue with a customer. Now, if I can't find our internal resources and how to deal with conflict or conflict resolution or something like that, and I use something external, now we lose control of what the ultimate customer experience is, because rather than using the internal content that is specific to our product, I'm looking for general content that, to your early point, lacks all of the context that makes it that useful. So we have the resource that will enable people, but discovery being an issue prevents them from using it. And now we've lost any real influence on the ultimate end performance and the ultimate customer experience. So when you think in those terms, it really is an issue that it's such a simple, quick win to just get everything to a place where it can be found, and imagine then the output it has. Crazy.
Yeah, I think it's recognizing that your LMS might be a really important thing for L&D, but it isn't to the employee, right? It's just another place where you're telling them to go to. And I think a lot of this actually comes from understanding your internal customer. And this is where I do think, we're big advocates of L&D could borrow a lot of stuff from product development and the product mindset. And a big part of that is really speaking to your internal customers and not doing something where I have an LMS, you need to come to the LMS. But the idea is you're serving an internal customer, you need to create your offering in a way that meets their needs and meets them where they are. And I think you'll find probably doesn't take a lot of conversation for you to find out that employees are saying it's just too hard to find it, right? And it might be, maybe you have centralized it, but the UX of the platform that you're using is just terrible, right? Like, it's just made it even hard because all they've done is aggregate everything. So before I was seeing 10 things, now I see a gazillion things. And it's just made it really difficult because it's just a long catalog. And, we recently saw a provider come up with, again, I'll tell you how not to do centralize is when you get like big ERP HR systems that kind of strong arm you into thinking, no, you need to have everything in one platform. If not, it's really difficult for these platforms to talk to each other. That's rubbish, right? Because in this day and age, with APIs, all of these things can talk to each other. But what amazed me was they were trying to sell on a learning platform, which was basically a long table catalog of courses. And I was like, if you really think this is going to solve the discovery channel, that a time poor employee is going to come and go for a 1,000,000 row table to find that content, we've really not spoken to the internal customer. That's how not to fall for the centralizing of tools. It's not about the centralizing of the tools, right? And that's got to be very clear. You can have, one of our biggest customers that we work with has about 25 different content libraries across the organization. So it's not about not get the best provider for everything you need, get the best tool, but you want to have a single point of access, right? You want to have a single, that's the key. The tools don't have to be all a part of the same provider, but the front door needs to be the same. What that allows you to do, it allows you to change the content sources in the background without changing the discovery experience for the employee.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's not just having it in one place, it's the point of access being the same, because if you do then keep having to change it, then what you do is create a bad experience for your end user, and because they're constantly getting used to a new front door or a new search function. And as someone who's sat in on user sessions where people use websites where it isn't a single scroll, I've seen people scroll past the thing they're looking for about 2 billion times. So that example where it's all in just one thing, good luck with that. Can't see it happening. But to your earlier point, the best way to find this out, why the friction's there, is to speak to your own customer. They might just say that, I don't know where to look. So maybe it's just like a, where is it issue? It might just be that the titles are really unclear. People might say that, we don't name things internally in a great way. There can be other parts of this where if you speak to your end user, they'll tell you what the quick win is, because they might just say, I never get what it is. Like, we have loads of resources with the same name, for example, as well. Like, these all feed into that discovery issue.
The deep diving problem discovery, Gary, you're talking about is so critical, right? Like, I often find, I think it's the last 3 years of LinkedIn's research says that time is one of the top 3 barriers to kind of learning engagement. That as a headline statistic, right? People are just busy, they don't prioritize learning, but there's probably a lot we can learn by digging into that statistic a bit more, right? Because what they might be saying is, I'm too busy to accommodate your really terrible user experience. I'm really busy to look in 10 different places to find the thing I'm looking for. I'm really busy to go through your catalog of irrelevant content to find the one thing that's relevant to me. Because what I don't buy is the interpretation that people are saying they're too busy to learn. Right? I don't buy that, because there's other data that doesn't support that. Even just speak to people again, right? And you'll realize most people are learning outside of work, right? They're listening to podcasts, they're reading blogs, they're going to LinkedIn because they think it's a place where they can learn from some of the things people are putting out there. So they're learning in their own way, right? And so I don't buy the fact that people don't have time to learn. They probably don't have time to learn the way the organization expects them to do it.
Yeah. I've made a note. That's my follow-up point for next year. You're right. There's no follow-up question to what does it mean to you to be too busy? Like, I don't know, Tom, what does that actually mean? Like you say, I'm too busy to be bored. I'm too busy, like you say, to sift through the million things. So 2024, watch this space. We're gonna ask that follow-up question, I think. Let's come back to AI, Nelson. We spoke about it earlier, but just to give it its own dedicated part, I mean, it poses a challenge in a couple of ways. One, it's changing the skills landscape, but it's also a potential solution to the issues we're facing with the growing pace of change, the speed with which we need to learn skills. But the trouble is the way it's currently being used by a lot of people, it makes it hard to see how that can happen. So, what is the issue with the way AI is currently being used, and what's the flip side of that, the win?
I think the way AI is primarily being used in L&D right now is for being more efficient, right? And don't get me wrong, I'm all for being more efficient, right? Like trying to do um, what we're doing now with less effort and with less cost and less resource. Yes, it's great. It's great as long as the thing you're trying to do more efficiently is the right thing that you should be doing, right? No one gets brownie points for not delivering an outcome or not hitting their target, but saying, well, at least I missed target efficiently, right? Is not going to get you anywhere. What we need to consider here is, are we using AI to be more effective, right? It's not just about being more efficient. Are we using it to be more effective? And that's what I'm not seeing enough of. Because what we've really seen, especially from a learning tech perspective, is a lot of providers have done the low-hanging fruit, right? It's relatively easier to increase the speed at which you can generate content and automate some of these routine tasks. But these harder challenges are more complex and sophisticated to solve for. And so I think it's focusing our energy to leverage AI to do this stuff that was significantly harder for us to do. And it's doing this analogy of, imagine you've got a peak, a small peak in a park, and then you've got the highest peak. Now, the question you need to ask yourself is, are you climbing a peak that you are already able to climb, but you're climbing it slightly easier with AI? Or do you want to climb the highest peak, which you've never climbed, right? You've never climbed because it's too high, but now you can climb it with AI. And so that's where I think we need to focus our energy on leveraging AI to solve those tougher challenges, which is the mapping of skills, the measuring of skills, creating precise, personalized learning experiences that can bridge those gaps. They're the harder challenges for us to be able to solve. And I think that's really where we need to be looking at AI, is to be more effective, not just more efficient.
Yeah, I think that comes back to what you said earlier about output, not being output focused and thinking about what is the way to tackle the significantly harder challenges rather than to do the easiest thing faster and with less effort, I guess. So perfect, very succinct. I think we'll wrap up the AI section there, because I'm sure that kind of ticks the boxes that people were looking for. We've got a couple more we wanted to discuss, Nelson, in terms of these big L&D challenges that can be wins. Now, another one that comes up on the reports year after year, terms like L&D impact and learning ROI. I've seen them every year for the last 4 years. Demonstrating impact remains a challenge. So I think you might have covered some of the key principles of this already, but what is the way that we actually overcome that challenge and start showing impact?
Yeah. We mentioned this before on the show, where you achieve what you measure, right? And if you're measuring a metric that is not aligned to business impact, right? And what that means is it's a metric that the business will care about, right? It's like when, your go-to-market function shouts about the net new revenue they've made. Everyone in the business gets that. They're all like, yeah, we made more revenue. We get that, right? And we're happy about that. But if you went and shouted to the business going, we got 70% course completion rate, right? Don't expect to get a high five from any other function, because it's not had a business impact. And so if you're measuring time spent learning, I've heard of organizations who measure their main target is making sure everyone does 40 hours of learning every month. Why? Right? Like, who cares about that in the business, that you're doing 40 hours of learning? And I think if that's the kind of metric you're measuring, time spent learning and course completion, then you're not going to be able to demonstrate impact or ROI, right? Because time spent learning isn't a return on investment, right? So you achieve what you measure. So let's start measuring the things that indicate impact, right? And that is things that can tell us if we helping improve the performance. And we use skills as a conduit for that, because what we're saying is, especially if you use a 360 feedback approach for measuring skills, it's evidence-based, right? My colleagues and my manager think I'm now demonstrating to a level 4 in my proficiency of this skill, because they've seen me apply that on a day-to-day, in my day-to-day performance. And so that actually starts to capture saying, the learning that we're offering is shaping performance and improving performance. And I can still see that from the way we do the skills assessment. Now, measuring skills helps you tell that story of impact, right? When the business asks you, when the C-suite asks you, what impact did you have on the organization? You can say, well, look, our OKR was X, and we realized we had gaps in X, Y, Z that are holding us back from achieving that OKR. We moved that delta. The delta was we moved everyone from a level 3 in product knowledge to a level 4 in product knowledge. And that has had an impact on this business KPI. And we can back this through the interviews that we've done with some of the people who are beneficiaries, right? Some of the employees, we asked them what changed their performance, and they referenced this learning experience that they did, this coaching session that they had. That's what the business wants to hear. So I think it's quite fundamentally going back to ask yourself now, what are you measuring? Are you measuring any metrics that can actually show that you're having an impact on the organization? If you're not, you might actually be having an impact on the business, right? Unknowingly. But you can't demonstrate it because you're not measuring any metrics that can help you build that story.
It's interesting thinking back to that data from last year. It's also worth asking yourself why you're measuring it, because a lot of people are measuring vanity metrics. The LinkedIn report from last year was that 6 out of the top 12 L&D success measures are vanity metrics, things like time spent learning, completion. And why are you measuring them is the other question. Like you say earlier, sometimes it's best to think of the worst case framing. Well, the worst case framing for which metrics I should measure would be I decided what they were without speaking to the business. The best case is I go to the business, I know what matters to them. Now, the efforts I'm doing are all about influencing those metrics that truly matter to the business. So do you think part of it is that people are deciding what to measure without, again, speaking to the people who can help them understand what success means, and then kind of then just trying to fit a narrative around the metrics they decided to measure maybe?
Yeah, and I think that probably alludes to the fact that we're only thinking about what matters to us, right? Like in L&D, we care about that because it's an indication that people have found our learning resource. They're engaging with it, which they're all good signals and metrics to measure to see whether you're moving in the right direction, but it doesn't tell you anything about the outcome. And I think we need to be aware of that. And I think that's where skills is such an important piece, because it's that universal language. It's a language the business understands. And I think that's what we need to move towards, is speaking a language the business understands. And I almost imagine this kind of, if I was to put it visually, on one side, you've got a bunch of L&D related things, right? Like, learning experiences, time spent, all of these different things. And then on the other side, you've got business KPIs, right? Like sales, pipeline, all of these things. And let's imagine these are two different languages. And I imagine in the middle, the kind of translator is skills, right? Like what connects the dot between what L&D are doing with what the business KPI is, this thing called skills, because that's what says, okay, this learning is connected to this skill, which is required to drive this business KPI. That's what connects the dots. And without that kind of layer in the middle that helps you connect things, you've basically got two things operating in a disconnected silo. You've got the business performance KPIs happening in one silo, and then you've got L&D, time spent learning, and all of those metrics happening in a different silo. And that's where the disconnect is, right? And while that disconnect exists, it's very hard to be able to demonstrate impact. And it's probably hard for you to have any kind of meaningful impact.
Yeah, I love that. I think something I've been doing a lot personally is thinking about the intention of the metrics. So like you say, use the things that are useful as signals to the thing they're intended to do. Like views on a piece of content is a good indicator that it's being found, but that's kind of it. That's where it ends. The time people spend on it is probably a signal of how engaging it is from the way it's structured and how easy it is to read. If people spend 30 seconds on it, it's either really good or really bad. If people spend 5 minutes on it, you probably have genuinely engaged them. So like you said, it's not about doing away with those metrics. It's about thinking about them intentionally. And then, like you say, the skills is really the connector. It's what skills are needed to get to this particular business outcome. And then that's how we really know that we influence something, isn't it, overall?
And I think it also comes to asking the question of, you're using these metrics to communicate something to the rest of the business, and it's asking, why do they care? Like if you're about to go to rest of the business and tell them here are my metrics. Just look at each of those metrics and go, okay, so why do I care? Like, what does that mean? And if you get stuck at some point, then it doesn't mean anything to them. It doesn't. We're not putting ourselves in their shoes to really understand what they want to get from it. It actually reminds me of, I read something recently which was around, we should be focused on comprehension, not communication. And I really like this because it was around. It's not about just saying something, right? It's not about me just delivering my message. It's about making sure the message has been received and understood. And that's where comprehension comes into play. And I think you can apply that for the metrics and the data storytelling, because you might be spitting out a bunch of data and saying a bunch of things. But actually, if it's not landed, I've not understood it, it's not really meant anything to me, then there's no comprehension. And so what was the point of the metric?
I'm glad you mentioned that, because when you said, why should they care about the data? Actually, I was thinking you should just apply that to everything. Like when you send an email to people
Yeah.
about learning, when you send a Slack message, when you send a voice note, like ask yourself why you should care, or why they should
Yeah.
care. Once you know that, then frame the way you communicate it around that. You mentioned data there, actually, and that leads us nicely to the last L&D challenge, because part of the reason people can't necessarily always show impact is incomplete data. So how can we overcome the issue of incomplete data and therefore start telling those great stories and turn the missing data set into, we have it and now we can tell a story that means we win overall?
Yeah, I think it's quite connected to this centralizing learning. It's almost like two sides of the same coin, where you've got scattered and fragmented learning both inside and outside of the organization. Now, that's not just a pain for the employee because they can't find stuff. It's also a huge challenge for you as an L&D team and the wider business, because you're probably because things are so scattered and fragmented, you don't have a complete view of someone's learning and development, right? And even the data you do have, you're probably having to run multiple reports from multiple systems and tools. So you're spending a lot of time and effort to get together data that actually is fundamentally incomplete. And so you don't have a full picture of that. Now, the benefit of centralizing all of your learning and bringing it together is we're able to give our customers a one-stop shop for all of their L&D data. So in the same way the employee benefits from a single front door to all of their learning, our L&D teams and businesses benefit from having a single view of all of the L&D data. So whether that's compliance, whether that's self-directed learning, or whether it's any other type of professional learning, informal, formal, it doesn't matter. And so in one place, you now get a real complete picture of what someone's learning, how they're learning, and now you can start to see what is the impact of that holistic learning on the skills that someone's trying to develop. So absolutely, there's an efficiency gain because you're not having to run as many reports and it doesn't take you as long. But there's also being more effective because for the first time, you have a complete view of someone's learning, and you can look at that complete view of someone's learning alongside the impact on skills development. And that's a huge game changer in terms of building that impact narrative. There's one step more that you can do to this. So we also have a budget management tool built into HowNow. And so what that allows you to do is directly connect money that you spent on L&D with all of your learning, and then connect that to directly what skills were developed as a result of the learning that you've done. So, we talk about ROI and impact narratives. That's all the data that you need right there to build that impact narrative. And so, if you've not got a single view of all of your learning and development, it's harder for you to make informed decisions. It's difficult for you to demonstrate impact. And you can't really double down on what's working, and more importantly, cut back on the things that are not.
Absolutely. I think it's similar to that thing from before, friction, just, similar to how you centralize, similar to how you make it discoverable. Do the same thing when it comes to your reporting, remove as much friction as you can, build the most complete picture you can, and therefore you are operating from a centralized view as opposed to trying to pull together lots of different things that are probably static and changing all the time that you're not necessarily the owner for. So brilliant note to end on, Nelson, because I know we're close to time. As I mentioned before, if anyone wants to know a bit more about HowNow and some of these features Nelson mentioned, there'll be a link in the description, or very simply go to getHowNow.com. If you're also not connected to Nelson already, then you should be. So you'll also find the link to Nelson's LinkedIn profile in the show notes as well. But Nelson, thank you. And we won't leave it 5 months next time before we chat again.
Thanks for having me back on the show, Gary.